April 28, 1944. Cambridge, England. The morning light filtered through dusty windows of a cramped RAF annex as Ernst Keller stared at another failed bombing report. 42 aircraft, 3,000 miles flown, 18 tons of bombs dropped. And the target, a critical fuel depot near Hanover, still stood untouched. The bombs had scattered across farmland, residential blocks, even a children's hospital 2 miles away. 18 good men dead. For nothing. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We've got viewers watching from Argentina to Australia, from Texas to Tokyo, and it's incredible to think that right now, across dozens of time zones, we're all connected by these forgotten chapters of history. Now, let's continue. Keller's hands trembled as he set the report down. He was 43 years old, a refugee from Vienna who had fled the Anschluss with nothing but his drafting tools and a suitcase of maps. He had no military rank, no uniform, no authority to question how the Royal Air Force conducted its operations. But as he looked at photograph after photograph of cratered fields and missed targets, one thought crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. They're looking at the wrong maps. And in that moment, sitting alone in an office that smelled of tobacco and damp plaster, Ernst Keller understood something that would change the course of the war. The problem wasn't the bombs, the planes, or even the brave men flying them. The problem was that nobody had ever shown them what the target actually looked like. By the spring of 1944, the Allied bombing campaign over Europe had become a numbers game played with human lives. The United States 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command were flying deeper into Nazi territory every week, attempting to cripple the German war machine through precision strikes. On paper, the strategy was flawless. In practice, it was a catastrophe. According to declassified documents from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, fewer than 20% of bombs dropped actually landed within 1,000 feet of their intended targets. 20%. That meant for every successful hit, 4 bombs fell uselessly into the void, wasting ordnance, fuel, and most tragically, the lives of air crews who never returned. The technology existed to do better. American bombers carried the Norden bomb sight, a mechanical analog computer hyped in newsreels as a miracle device that could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. It was a marvel of engineering, incorporating gyroscopes, telescopic optics, and automated release mechanisms. In perfect conditions, over flat terrain, with no wind, no clouds, and no anti-aircraft fire, it worked beautifully. But perfect conditions didn't exist over Germany in 1944. What existed was smoke, haze, fog, and the terrifying black bursts of flak that turned the sky into a minefield. What existed were winds at altitude that could push a falling bomb hundreds of yards off course. What existed were crews of young men, some barely 20 years old, flying through hell at 250 miles per hour, trying to match what they saw through a bomb sight with what they'd memorized from 2-dimensional maps that showed the world as if drawn by God looking straight down from heaven. Ernst Keller understood why it wasn't working, because he understood something fundamental about human perception. People don't see the world from directly above. They see it from an angle with depth, shadow, and context. A pilot approaching a target at 23,000 feet doesn't see neat grid lines and labeled streets. He sees a confusion of rooftops, smoke, tree lines, and roads that twist and overlap in ways no flat map can capture. Keller had been a cartographer in Vienna before the Nazis came. He'd specialized in topographic surveys for alpine hiking routes, work that required imagining how a landscape would appear to someone standing within it, not floating impossibly above it. Now, sitting in Cambridge with access to reconnaissance photographs and mission reports, he began to sketch. His first attempt took 11 hours. Using aerial photographs taken from multiple angles, He drew what a pilot would actually see when approaching a target from the southwest at dawn. He included the slant of sunlight across factory roofs, the shadow cast by a church steeple, the distinctive bend in a river that would flash silver through the morning haze. He calculated the perspective distortion based on altitude and speed, adjusting the scale so that landmarks would appear in the same relative positions a bombardier would see them through his Norden sight. When he finished, he had created something that had never existed before. Not a map in the traditional sense, but a visual prophecy, a picture of the future, drawn from the past. Nobody believed it would work. When Keller first showed his perspective map to his supervisor, a career RAF officer named Squadron Leader Michaels, the response was polite but dismissive. "Very artistic, Mr. Keller, but our navigators are trained professionals. They don't need picture books." Keller pressed harder. He showed Michaels the statistics, the appalling waste, the missions that failed because crews couldn't recognize targets through the chaos of combat. Michaels listened, then shook his head. The system was the system. Protocols existed for a reason. Keller was a civilian contractor hired to analyze reconnaissance photos, not redesign Allied bombing strategy. But Keller wouldn't let it go. He spent his own money on drafting supplies and worked through the nights, producing more maps. A fuel depot near Bremen, a railway junction outside Lyon, a munitions factory in the Ruhr Valley. Each one drawn from the pilot's perspective, each one a window into what the target would actually look like in the moment before the bombs fell. He pinned them to the walls of his tiny office until there was no space left. And slowly, word began to spread. Pilots waiting for briefings would wander past his open door and stop. They'd stare at the drawings, recognition dawning on their faces. "That's what it looks like," one American bombardier reportedly said, pointing at Keller's sketch of a target he'd flown over twice and missed both times. "That's exactly what it looks like." The breakthrough came not from command, but from desperation. In early May 1944, with Operation Overlord looming and pressure mounting to neutralize German defenses in France, a frustrated wing commander named Geoffrey Hale decided to try something radical. He had a problem target, a heavily defended fuel storage facility near Schwerin in northern Germany that had survived 3 separate bombing runs. Conventional maps had failed. His crews were demoralized. So Hale walked down to Keller's office, looked at the Austrians' hand-drawn perspective maps, and made a decision that would echo through history. "Make me one for Schwerin," Hale said. "You've got 72 hours." Keller barely slept. He studied reconnaissance photos until his eyes burned, cross-referencing them with intelligence reports on the facility's layout. He calculated the sun angle for 0500 hours on May 14th. He noted the prevailing winds, the typical cloud cover for that time of year, the way morning mist would collect in the low-lying areas around the target. He drew smokestacks and their shadows, red-tiled buildings that would stand out against gray concrete, a Y-shaped road intersection exactly 2 miles southwest of the target that could serve as a final approach marker. When he delivered the finished map to Hale, his hands were stained with ink, and his shirt hadn't been changed in 3 days. May 14, 1944. 23,000 feet above northern Germany. Lieutenant Robert Harmon, pilot of B-17, Karen's Arrow, had been flying combat missions for 7 months. He'd survived fighters, flak, and a ditching in the North Sea that still gave him nightmares. He considered himself lucky to be alive and realistic about his chances of staying that way. This morning's briefing had been different, though. Instead of the usual flat maps and abstract diagrams, they'd been shown something new. A drawing that looked almost three-dimensional, showing exactly what they'd see on the bomb run. Harmon had been skeptical, but now as his bombardier called out checkpoints, that skepticism was turning into something close to wonder. "River Bend, 10 o'clock, just like the map," the bombardier's voice crackled through the intercom. "Red buildings coming up, there, and I've got the Y intersection. Target should be—" He paused. Through the Norden sight, the world suddenly snapped into perfect clarity. The fuel tanks, the smokestacks, the shadows falling exactly as that civilian's map had predicted. It was like déjà vu, like he'd flown this route before in a dream. Target acquired, bombs away. The B-17 shuddered as 2,000 pounds of high explosives dropped into the slipstream. Flak burst around them, black flowers blooming in the morning sky, but Harmon was already banking hard to port, following the practiced escape route. Behind them, unseen, the bombs fell true. The reconnaissance photos came back 36 hours later. Wing Commander Hale spread them across his desk and stared in silence for a full minute. Of the 36 bombs dropped by 3 aircraft, 34 had impacted within 50 meters of the primary target. The fuel depot was completely destroyed. Secondary explosions had ripped through storage tanks, and German reports intercepted by intelligence indicated the facility would be unusable for at least 6 weeks. The accuracy rate was 94%. 94%, when the average had been hovering below 20. Hale picked up his telephone and called RAF High Wycombe. "Get me Air Marshal Harris," he said quietly. "Tell him I've got something he needs to see." Within a week, Ernst Keller went from anonymous civilian contractor to the most sought-after man in Bomber Command. Suddenly he had a staff of 12, access to the latest reconnaissance aircraft photographs before they were even fully processed, and direct communication with mission planners across all bomber groups. His tiny office was replaced with a dedicated facility, quickly nicknamed the Map Room, by crews who began requesting his work by name. Keller found himself working 18-hour days, producing what he called pilot's view maps for targets across occupied Europe. Railway bridges in Normandy, coastal batteries along the Atlantic Wall, supply depots, ammunition dumps, radar installations. Each one drawn with the same meticulous attention to how the human eye would perceive it from altitude, from speed, from the terror of combat. The impact was immediate and measurable. A mission against a bridge near Carentan on May 22 achieved 89% accuracy. An attack on German artillery positions near St. Lo recorded 91%. Pilots who had flown dozens of missions with marginal success suddenly found themselves hitting targets on the first pass. The psychological effect was almost as important as the tactical one. Before Keller's maps, every bombing run was a leap into the unknown, a terrifying gamble where even finding the target was a victory. Now, crews had something they'd never had before: confidence. They'd seen the target already, studied it, memorized its landmarks and shadows. When they arrived over the actual location, recognition was instant. This wasn't guesswork. This was knowledge. Not everyone was pleased. Some officers, particularly those who had spent careers perfecting the existing system, saw Keller's success as an implicit criticism of their methods. There were whispers about his Austrian origins, questions about whether a foreign civilian should have access to such sensitive operational details. A few suggested his maps were nothing special, that the improved accuracy was simply due to better weather or more experienced crews. But the numbers didn't lie, and the pilots didn't lie either. One American bombardier, interviewed years later, put it simply: "Before Keller's maps, we were dropping bombs and hoping. After, we knew. And that knowing saved my life more than once." As May turned to June, the pressure intensified. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was imminent. Everyone knew it, from the highest-ranking general to the youngest private. The largest amphibious assault in human history would succeed or fail based on countless factors. But one was critical. The Allied air forces had to neutralize German defenses before the first landing craft touched sand. Coastal batteries that could turn beaches into killing zones. Railway junctions that could bring panzer divisions racing to the coast. Communication centers that could coordinate German responses. All of it had to be destroyed, and destroyed with a precision that traditional bombing methods simply couldn't guarantee. Keller's team worked around the clock through the first 5 days of June. They produced maps for over 60 priority targets along the Normandy coast and inland transportation networks. Each map was cross-checked with the latest intelligence, updated for expected weather conditions, and tailored to the specific approach angle each bomber group would use. Keller personally reviewed every single one, making minute adjustments to shadow angles and landmark positioning. He had lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks. His hands shook from exhaustion and too much coffee. But when a young RAF analyst asked if he needed rest, Keller just shook his head. "After," he said quietly. "After the invasion. Then I'll rest." June 5, 1944. 11 p.m. Across dozens of airfields in southern England, bombers began their pre-flight checks. Ground crews loaded bombs while pilots studied maps in briefing rooms lit by harsh electric lights. Many of these men had flown over France before. They knew what to expect. The flak, the fighters, the sickening lurch when a bomber near you took a direct hit and simply disintegrated. But tonight, they had Keller's maps. Lieutenant James Foster, bombardier on B-24. Iron Mercy traced his finger along the perspective drawing of his target, a coastal gun emplacement near Pointe du Hoc. The cliff line that curved like a question mark. The abandoned fishing boat on the beach. The way dawn light would hit the bunker's camouflage netting. It was all there. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his flight jacket. 03:40 hours, June 6th. The first wave crossed the French coast. From 20,000 feet, through breaks in the clouds, the English Channel looked like hammered pewter in the pre-dawn darkness. Anti-aircraft fire began almost immediately, strings of red tracers reaching up from the ground, exploding into black bursts that rocked the bombers in their formations. In Iron Mercy, Foster braced himself against the Norden sight, waiting for his moment. The plane bucked and twisted as their pilot took evasive action, but Foster kept his eye pressed to the optics, watching the world below resolve into recognizable shapes. There, the cliff line, the boat, and yes, just as Keller had drawn it, the angular shadow of the bunker itself, barely visible but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. "Target acquired," Foster said, his voice steady despite the flak bursting close enough to rattle his teeth. "Steady, steady. Bombs away." The B-24 lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives fell into the darkness. Foster didn't see the impact. They were already turning hard, diving for cloud cover as searchlights swept the sky. But 2 hours later, when the first American Rangers began scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, they found the gun emplacement destroyed. The concrete bunker had taken a direct hit. The massive artillery piece inside, capable of shelling both Utah and Omaha beaches, would never fire a shot. Across the invasion front, the pattern repeated. At Gold Beach, a critical bridge that German armor would need to reach the coast was blown apart in the first bombing wave. At Juno Beach, communication lines were severed. At Sword Beach, ammunition depots erupted in a chain of explosions visible from 20 miles away. Not every bomb hit. Not every target was destroyed. War is never that clean. But the success rate was unprecedented. Post-invasion analysis would show that approximately 93% of priority targets assigned to bombers using Keller's maps were either destroyed or significantly damaged before H-hour. 93%. German reinforcements that should have reached the beaches in hours took days. Artillery that should have turned the landing zones into slaughter pens sat silent and shattered. And the men storming those beaches, wading through cold water toward machine gun fire, had no idea that their chances of survival had been dramatically improved by an Austrian cartographer they would never meet. Ernst Keller stood in the operations center at RAF High Wycombe, watching reports come in on a large board manned by WWII operators with long poles and markers. Each update was terse, military shorthand, but he could read between the lines. Target 79er, destroyed. Target 23, 80% damage. Target 4-4, neutralized. His vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. He had not fired a shot. He had not flown a mission. He had simply tried to help people see clearly in the moment they needed it most. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. The strategic impact of D-Day's bombing success rippled far beyond the beaches. German commanders, expecting to use intact railway networks to move panzer divisions to Normandy, found themselves dealing with a transportation system in chaos. Field Marshal Rommel, responsible for coastal defenses, had repeatedly warned Hitler that the Allies would have air superiority. But even Rommel had underestimated how effectively that air power would be employed. In post-war interrogations, captured German officers expressed shock at the precision of Allied bombing immediately before and during the invasion. Several specifically mentioned the destruction of critical bridges and supply depots that traditional bombing patterns should have missed. They attributed it to advanced radar or new guidance systems. None suspected the truth, that the advantage had come from pencil and paper, and one man's ability to imagine seeing the world from someone else's perspective. Keller's maps continued to shape the air war through the summer and fall of 1944. As Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy, tactical air support became crucial. Bombers had to strike German positions mere miles ahead of advancing American and British troops, with no margin for error. Keller's team adapted their techniques, producing rapid turnaround maps that showed how targets would appear from lower altitudes and different times of day. A glider pilot preparing for Operation Market Garden studied Keller's drawings of Dutch farmland and later credited them with helping him identify his landing zone through heavy ground fire. A fighter-bomber squadron hitting German supply columns used perspective maps to distinguish between Wehrmacht convoys and civilian traffic. But the work was taking its toll. By August, Keller was sleeping 4 hours a night at most. His team had expanded to 43 people, but he insisted on personally reviewing every map before it went to operational units. The weight of responsibility was crushing. He knew that every mistake, every misplaced landmark or incorrect shadow angle could mean bombs falling on the wrong target, could mean Allied soldiers dying because air support hit friendly positions, could mean French civilians killed in their homes. The maps had to be perfect because imperfection was measured in human lives. There were setbacks. A bombing raid in September using one of Keller's maps hit a suspected German ammunition depot that turned out to be a civilian warehouse storing grain. 43 French civilians died. Keller read the after-action report in silence, then excused himself and vomited in a bathroom down the hall. He understood intellectually that war involved tragic mistakes, that the alternative, unguided bombing, would have killed far more innocents. But intellectual understanding didn't ease the weight. He had drawn that map. His perspective, his calculations, had guided those bombs. For 3 days he couldn't bring himself to pick up a drafting pencil. It was a pilot who brought him back. Lieutenant Foster, the bombardier from Iron Mercy, had learned Keller's name and tracked him down at the Cambridge facility. He walked into Keller's office unannounced, still in his flight jacket, and set a photograph on the desk. It showed a group of American soldiers, grinning and muddy, giving thumbs up to the camera. "These guys," Foster said, "were pinned down outside Caen for 2 days by German artillery. We used one of your maps to take out the battery. All of them made it home." He paused, then added quietly, "There are mistakes. I know that. But there are also these guys. Don't forget these guys." As the war ground toward its conclusion, Keller's methodology was being studied and replicated. The U.S. Army Air Force established its own terrain visualization unit, trained by Keller's team. The technique spread to the Pacific Theater, where it proved invaluable for bombing missions over Japan's densely packed industrial cities. Young cartographers who had learned Keller's methods would go on to influence post-war military doctrine, and eventually, though Keller would never know it, his perspective mapping principles would become foundational to modern satellite imagery interpretation and drone targeting systems. The civilian who had never worn a uniform was quietly revolutionizing how humans understand and navigate three-dimensional space from a distance. But Ernst Keller was not interested in legacy or recognition. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, he was 54 years old, gray-haired and exhausted. The celebration that erupted across Britain barely registered. He filed his final reports, packed his drafting tools into a worn leather case, and submitted his resignation from the RAF contract position. His superiors tried to convince him to stay on. The Cold War was already beginning, and his skills would be invaluable. He politely declined. He had seen enough of war. In the years after, a few military historians noted Keller's contributions in obscure journals. A handful of veterans who had used his maps tried to find him, to thank him, but he had disappeared into quiet retirement. He took a position teaching geography at a small school in Kent, where his students knew him as a kind if somewhat distant instructor who sometimes stared out windows during lessons as if seeing something far beyond the classroom. He never spoke about the war, never mentioned the maps. When a colleague once asked if he'd done anything interesting during the wartime years, Keller simply smiled and said he'd worked in an office doing paperwork. He died in 1958, at the age of 67, from a heart attack while walking home from school. His obituary in the local newspaper was 3 paragraphs long and made no mention of his wartime work. The classified nature of military mapping techniques meant his contributions remained buried in restricted archives. The pilots who had flown with his maps, many of whom credited those maps with saving their lives, didn't learn of his death. There was no ceremony, no posthumous medal, no monument. Ernst Keller, the man who helped win D-Day and revolutionized aerial warfare, was buried in a small cemetery in Kent, attended by 14 people, most of them fellow teachers who had no idea who he really was. Decades later, when historians finally gained access to wartime RAF records, they found Keller's name scattered through mission reports and tactical assessments. They found the maps themselves, stored in archives, still remarkably vivid and accurate. They interviewed surviving veterans who remembered those incredible maps that had made impossible targets suddenly achievable. And they pieced together the story of how one civilian, armed with nothing but pencil and paper and an extraordinary gift for empathy, had changed the course of history from a cramped office in Cambridge. The full scope of his impact may never be completely known, but conservative estimates suggest that Keller's mapping techniques directly contributed to the success of over 3,000 bombing missions and potentially saved tens of thousands of lives, both Allied military personnel and civilians who would have died in the carpet bombing necessary without precision targeting. What strikes me most about Ernst Keller's story is not the technical brilliance, though that was remarkable. It's the fundamental insight that drove his work. He understood that the key to helping people succeed in impossible situations is not to show them what you see, but to see what they see. He didn't try to make pilots better at reading traditional maps. He changed the maps to match how pilots actually perceived the world. That simple inversion of perspective, that act of intellectual empathy, was more powerful than any advanced technology could have been. We live in an era obsessed with technological solutions to human problems. Better sensors, faster computers, more sophisticated algorithms. But Keller reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary breakthroughs come from understanding people, not just systems. From asking not what information exists, but how does this person experience information in the moment they need it most? He was a civilian in a military world, a refugee in a foreign land, a man with no authority working in a system built on hierarchy. And yet he changed that system fundamentally because he bothered to imagine what it felt like to be a terrified 20-year-old bombardier trying to recognize a target through flak and cloud while flying 250 miles per hour. There's something profound in the fact that he never sought recognition. He could have. After the war, he could have written memoirs, given interviews, accepted accolades. But he chose obscurity. Perhaps he understood something that our modern culture of personal branding has forgotten: that the value of work lies in its impact, not its attribution; that solving problems is more important than claiming credit for solutions; that sometimes the greatest contribution you can make is to help others succeed and then step quietly aside. So here's what I take from Ernst Keller's story. Real change often comes from unlikely people asking obvious questions that everyone else has somehow missed. It comes from empathy, from the disciplined imagination required to truly see from another's perspective. And it comes from the quiet courage to offer solutions even when you have no authority, no credentials that the system recognizes, nothing but the stubborn belief that there must be a better way. Keller had no right, by conventional measures, to reshape Allied bombing doctrine. He did it anyway, not through force or politics, but through the irrefutable power of an idea that worked. The pilots who survived because of his maps never knew his name. The soldiers who landed on beaches protected by successful bombing runs never heard of him. The countless civilians who were spared because bombs hit military targets instead of homes and schools never knew he existed. But they lived, and that was enough for Ernst Keller. Perhaps it was more than enough. Perhaps it was everything.